the flower, one more organ that we'll just talk about. So remember, this is another example of a plant organ. And again, you might have, we're kind of reviewing all the grade 10 stuff right now, and then we're going to expand on it into the grade 11 stuff a little bit later on. Not all plants have flowers. It's important to realize that the flowering plants is a group of plants. And in this class, later on, we're going to learn about all the different groups of animals and plants and how we put them in their different families and species and genuses. But the flowering plants are actually a relatively late comer on the evolutionary sort of scale or the evolutionary timeline. The flowering plants. And the reason is because flowering plants use something called sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction. So it's possible to reproduce yourself in many different ways, and some of them involve simply just kind of cutting off pieces of yourself and letting them grow into a new organism, like cloning or vegetative reproduction, which many plants can do. Some of you might know that you can take a cutting from a plant. You can take a piece of the leaf or the stem, and you can put it in water, and it'll sprout roots, and then you can plant it as a new plant. And all it is an exact clone of the other. But of course, and there are even some animals that can do this. The planarian worm, if you slice them in half, they'll just grow into two new worms. It's actually pretty cool. You can do really weird things with the planarian worms. You can cut them halfway and they'll grow two heads. Yeah, weird stuff. But somewhere along the sort of evolutionary line, the idea of sexual reproduction came along. Now you have to get past the human idea of when we say the word sex in biology, we don't mean necessarily just what humans do. You're thinking of what we call copulation in biology. Sex occurs anytime two organisms exchange genetic material or information. Right? They exchange or they combine. I guess a word exchange, or we could even put combine here. And so essentially to have sex, all you need are sperms and eggs, specialized cells that carry two sort of specially made what we call gametes, or cells that can produce sexually. And what happens there, and when we get into our genetics part of our unit, we'll talk more about this and how it works. But basically, it produces cells that have half the normal number of chromosomes. And then when they combine, they go back to normal, but half are from mom and half are from dad, so to speak. But even the concept of mom and dad is hard to, it isn't always true. For instance, just to give you some ideas, the earthworm has both male and female parts. And when two earthworms mate, they sort of mate with each other. Each one gives sperm to the other. So it's like, it's not always the same as with humans. It's very, very amazing, all the different ways Mother Nature has figured this out. And of course, what we're going to talk about is the flower, which is the way plants have figured out how to exchange genetic information. And the reason that's very successful is because it produces more variation in the genes, which makes the entire species more susceptible to sudden changes in the environment. Okay, so let's just draw ourselves a nice picture of a flower. Flowers come in all shapes and sizes and colors and variations, and so they don't always look like this picture, so we're going to draw sort of the quintessential flower picture. It's a flower that'll have all the parts obvious enough so that we can see them. And we'll start with red, a nice colorful red, to make the petals of the flower. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to draw sort of an arc, and then another arc, and then a third arc, something like that. That's easy to draw. And then I'll shift to green, and we'll draw sort of a pointy structure here, which comes down to where the stem is, and another pointy structure here, which then goes up here to the stem. And then we'll sort of complete this like this. And then we're going to draw a sticky outy thing that looks like this, like that. So this is like a cutaway, a cross section if you cut a flower in half. Oh, my mistake. Oh, shoot. I want to make this a little bit, I want to draw some stuff in there, so I need it a little bigger. Oh no. So let's just make this kind of bulge out like this a little bit at the bottom. More like that. If you want, you can put a couple of little leaves over here on the plant stem. Now, inside here, I'm going to draw another little circle because this is going to be like a cutaway of what's going on inside this structure here. And now we can color. Let's do some coloring, some green coloring here. Crayon. That green will work. And we'll just kind of shade this all in. Shade it around like that. Shade it in. There. That's the basic idea anyway. And then we're going to add in another color. Let's use this nice orangey. Oh, that's too close to red. Let's use a, I want to use something reasonably close to the actual color. So let's use this. First pen, then that, then a fine line, and hopefully we're going to draw these little guys that come out like this, and they have a little thing on them. Here's another one. Maybe another one over here, and another one over there. Something like that. That's basically the structures of the flower. And each of these structures, of course, is made of different cells that are different tissues. But they form all these structures which then fit together, these tissues working together to produce a reproductive organ that allows the flower to actually have sex. I'm going to take black, and inside here I'm just going to draw some little dots, something like that. Maybe just kind of connect them, something like that. Okay, let's label some parts. We'll use the black pen here. Obviously, we have the petals of the flower. Don't write petals as in a bicycle. They're not pedals. They are petals. So keep that in mind when you're writing this word with a T. Okay, and we'll write down what the petals are for and what all the different flower structures are for after we get them labeled. These little pointy green things are called sepals. There's sort of several of them. We've only drawn two, but they kind of wrap around. Essentially, when the flower develops, it develops as a bud, and the tissues are wrapped in these leafy sepals. And then what happens is as the flower grows, the sepals pop open, and the flower grows out of that, and the sepals then are underneath. We have a stem, which really is not part of the flower itself, but does serve a necessary purpose. Flowers have to be noticeable. They have to be sort of, out there where things can find them. And then, of course, some leaves. We won't worry about those. Now, the working parts of the flower. So we have this green thing in the middle, which has three separate sections to it. So the first section is, I'm going to draw a line like this, right? Well, I guess the arrow should go here. And what we have here is the whole sort of rounded area, and inside of the little black dots are the developing egg cells of the plant. They're not seeds. Don't call them seeds, because you don't get to be called a seed until after flowers have had their sex. Okay, so a seed is kind of like at humans. We talk about a fertilized cell, right? after fertilization. We call it a zygote. Remember that word, maybe? We're going to be very careful to use the words that we need to use. So this is called the ovary. And inside of it are the, egg cells. Look at that, I was about to write seeds. Inside of it are the egg cells that are developing. So I'll just put that in brackets. The next section is sort of the middle part, right there, which is called the style. And then the very tip is called the stigma. The stigma, the style, and the ovary. And all of these three things together make up this entire structure, which is called the pistil. Not the pistol with an O that you use to shoot people, but the pistil, as in the female part of the flower. We know it's the female part, obviously. Hopefully you figured that out since it has the ovary and is producing eggs, right? And then down below, we'll label the other structures, these little long filamenty things. Well, there's the top part, which is called the anther, and the long little tip or stem that it's on is called the filament, because it's like a little filament. And these two together make up the boy part of the flower, which is called the stamen. So a flower is interesting. It's both boy and girl at the same time. Many animals have developed the sexual dimorphism, we call it, where boys and girls are different. But in flowers, they're all kind of the same, and everybody has a little bit of everything. Okay, what do these things do? Again, I'll tell you what they do, and you can make a list and write it down. So, flower, the petals. Let's start with the petals. The petals are very colorful. And they have actual patterns of color that humans can't even see, believe it or not. They have patterns of color in reds and blues and yellows, but also ultraviolet and shades of purples and things that are beyond human vision. And so what that means is that they have weird patterns that we don't even see. And a lot of these patterns look like kind of like targets or bullseyes. And what they do is bees can see them. So the entire purpose of the petal is to attract the pollinators, which are the animals, or they're all animals as far as I know, the animals that can help the flower have sex. Because see, flowers have a problem. They don't walk. They can't get around. It makes it very hard to meet someone, right? You can't go on a date. So flowers have to rely on animals who can move to actually deliver their sperm from one to the other, which is weird. Luckily, humans don't have this problem. It makes things very awkward. All right, so the petals are there to provide beautiful colors, which attract pollinators. That's essentially what they do. The other thing that attracts pollinators that flowers make also are smells, which is why we like them. They make all kinds of odors that attract insects. Now, we like some flowers because they smell pretty, but there are also flowers that smell really bad. And if you think about it, if you're trying to attract bugs, a lot of bugs and flies and things are attracted to gross, rotting, disgusting things. So there are many flowers that smell like rotting garbage, and they're not pleasant. Obviously, we don't put those in bouquets and give them to people because it might send the wrong message, right? So there's the petals. The sepals. The sepals are sort of the leaf-like structures that form the bud of the flower. As the flower develops, it develops inside this protective bud. And then the bud sort of pops open at the top and out springs the flower. So the sepals are just there as remnants of the original flower bud outer sort of layer. The stem obviously lifts the flower or extends the flower out from the plant so that it can be seen more easily by pollinators. Flowers often shoot up high above the plant itself so that they're in a nice, highly visible spot. So the stem does serve an important purpose. It also, of course, contains the vascular bundles that provide the flow of nutrients, xylem and phloem tissue, right, into the flower and back. So that's important. There's the stem. So that leaves us with the female and male parts, the pistil and the stamen, and their subsequent smaller sections. So I think what we'll do is we'll go through how the flower actually functions to describe those. So essentially, the flower has to produce sperm. Sperm is produced at the anther. So the purpose of the anther is it contains cells that will produce sperm. We're going to learn more detail about this later, but for now, we'll just call it sperm production. Some of you may have learned about meiosis in grade 10. Hands up if you learned about meiosis. Only a couple. So we're going to have to go through that later. And that's that process of cell division that makes sperm and egg cells. Anyway, that's happening here at the anther. The filament, of course, is basically a little stalk. And it has a purpose. It has to get the anther out in front. Because what's going to happen is a pollinator is going to come along. Let's say it's a bee. Pollinators can be bees, they can be other bugs. In fact, sometimes even bats or moths. There are some flowers that use bats as pollinators. They're giant flowers in the tropics. You have to attract them. So what happens is way down here, I'll just use some black here, way down in this area, there are special cells that secrete this delicious nectar. Nectar. People often confuse nectar and pollen. What attracts bees to flowers is not really pollen. They're really coming after the nectar, which is the sweet, sugary liquid that is produced at the base. So as the bee comes in, what happens is the boy parts of the flower, the stamen, matures first. The pistil remains immature and unable to do anything because all we want to do here is we want to get our sperm on the pollinator. So the anther produces sperm, which now is all over the surface of that anther. But the sperm is produced in a little special coat. You can't just throw sperm out there, they'll die. They're very delicate. So what the flower does is it produces sort of a little protein jacket and puts the sperm inside. I'll make these little sperms. And that's called a pollen grain. Okay? If you look at pollen grains under the microscope, they often have little spikes and shapes. They're all very weird shapes and things. But they're essentially a protein jacket that protects the sperm inside. So pollen is flower sperm. So, you know, in the spring, when you go outside, all the pine trees are releasing this yellow dust of pollen, and it falls on your car, it falls on everything. That's basically pine tree sperm. But it's all nice and packaged in the pollen grains. So the anthers are producing the pollen. Okay? So the story is that the pollinator is attracted to the flower by the pretty colors, the nice odors, and the delicious nectar that's being secreted. So while the little bee is in there rooting around trying to drink up that nectar, its body is rubbing all over the anthers and it's collecting the pollen grains that contain the sperm. So now the bee is covered in pollen. Now, just like the mafia, right? Just like the mafia, the flower is very smart. If the mafia wants to take a hit out on somebody, they hire a guy. They usually do something where they're like, okay, we want this person taken out. It's 10,000 now, and then it's another 10,000 when you bring me the head. Because they want to make sure they do it. If you give them the money, they'll just run. How do you guarantee it gets the job done? So you promise them a bonus when they come back. And so what the flower does is it produces tiny amounts of nectar. Not enough to make the bee full, just enough to say, hey, I like this stuff. And then it's all gone, so the bee has to fly away to another flower to get more. And of course, now he's carrying the sperm of this flower. Now, when he gets to another flower, that flower may have already done this. Perhaps another bee has already been there, already taken the sperm, and that flower has developed a little further along. So the anthers and filaments wither and die once they've done their job. And now the pistil has matured. When the pistil matures, the stigma, the tip, is covered in a secretion that makes it all gooey and drippy and wet. If you ever think about an Easter lily, the yellow dust on the anthers is clearly visible, and the little pistil, which sticks out there, is quite visible, and you can see it drips with kind of like a goo, right? So when the bee comes along with some other flower's sperm and pollen on it, it now bumps into the pistil, which is matured on this particular flower. It's already given its sperm away before. And when it rubs in there and bumps around looking for more nectar, it deposits the pollen onto the stigma of the pistil. This pollen then sort of gets caught in the gooey liquid, and it causes the protein coat to break open, releasing the sperm. And then the sperm actually travel down channels that open. Little channels open up in the style because of the sperm that's landed there, and they travel down this way until they reach the developing egg cells, and they fertilize them. And then the fertilized egg cells become seeds, and they begin to grow. Now, of course, once these jobs are done, certain structures aren't needed anymore. So once the flower attracts its pollinator, you don't need petals anymore. They're expensive to maintain. They cost a lot of energy. And so typically what happens is the petals begin to wither and die and fall off. We don't need those anymore once the egg cells have been fertilized. And the flower begins to fall apart. And the stamens and the anther filaments have all withered away. All that's really left, even the style and the stigma sort of wither off. All that's left is this little area right here, the ovary of the plant. Now the ovary of the plant is where the developing seeds are. And so what happens now, here are the sepals, the ovary begins to grow and swell up. Right? The ovary contains the developing fertilized seeds, but it grows and it swells up, and it's pumped full of fluid, the tissue grows, and it turns into what we call a fruit. And the reason it does this is because you can't just have a bunch of seeds and then just drop them on the ground at the base of the stem. There'll be too much competition. We got to spread the seeds out. We got to get the seeds across the field where there's more room. And so by making a delicious fruit full of sugar, other animals are now utilized by the flower to move the seeds around. A deer comes along and it swallows this delicious fruit, which by now might have become an apple with the fully developed seeds inside. And the deer eats the apple. They don't eat it like us. They don't nibble around the core and throw away the core. They just eat the entire apple. They swallow the seeds. The seeds are designed to survive the digestive system of the deer. So a little while later, the deer redeposits those seeds in a nice, convenient little pile of fertilizer somewhere far away. And the seeds have been spread out. And so the plant uses fruits and things to attract other animals to help disperse the seeds. Okay? Now, some plants, that's basically the idea. And then the seed, of course, then grows into a new individual. But some plants don't require pollinators. They don't require bees, so they don't have the same setup. The flower looks totally different. It usually doesn't have big, colorful petals, because who cares? We don't need a pollinator. Instead, like the flowers of, say, a pine tree, right? The cones on the pine tree are essentially the flowers. And what they do is they produce their sperm, but rather than get a pollinator to come and get it, the pine tree just opens up the cone and out comes the pollen as a dust, and it relies on the wind to scatter the dust everywhere. That dust will scatter on the wind, and it will find a female cone on a different tree, and it will lodge on the cone, and it will find its way inside, and will fertilize the egg cells that way. So pollination can occur by animals like bees, but it can also occur by the wind or the water. If you live in the water, a water plant can utilize the water currents to deliver pollen. So some plants use pollinators and some don't, and the ones that don't, they don't need nectar. They don't need fancy petals. And so their flowers, although they're typically called flowers because they're still the same organ, they look vastly different than what we would consider a flower. And likewise, when it comes time to spread the seeds around, some don't rely on animals either. The maple tree has flowers, and it makes seeds. The maple tree seeds develop these huge little wings, and the seed is sort of in the middle, and it comes off here like this, and then there's all these veins in here, these membranous wings, so that when it's dislodged from the tree, it begins to flip on the wind, and these maple peas, they're called, they can helicopter around and travel sometimes many kilometers away. So they rely on the wind and the air to move the seeds around instead of a deer eating the apple. And so maple trees don't make delicious fruits because they're not trying to attract someone to eat their seeds. Instead, this is the fruit of the maple tree, essentially, and it's a totally different structure because it's not designed to be delicious, it's designed to be aerodynamic. And there are many, many different sort of ways that plants disperse their seeds. One of the clever ones is instead of making a delicious apple, the fruit evolves into a very weird-looking thing with tiny little spikes all over it. And these spikes actually have a little hook on the end. Little hooked spikes. And when an animal walks by, this gets caught in their fur and it breaks off. We call it a burr, right? And it gets stuck in their fur. Inside that burr are the seeds. So now the animal carries the seeds far, far away, and eventually the burr, you gotta go? Yeah, eventually the burr dries up, cracks open, and lets the seeds go. And in fact, the burr is very neat because under the microscope, if you look at these little hooks, they look like this. And so somebody who was studying burrs said, I have an idea. I'm going to make little plastic hooks, kind of the same size. And then on the other side of this, I'm going to make little hoops, little loops of string or fabric or whatever. And when I push this against that, just like the burr gets stuck in animal fur, all these little loops will stick into the hooks and get stuck. And that makes, of course, Velcro. Velcro is basically an artificial burr. And it was made or inspired by the way the burr works with flowers. So that's kind of cool, too. Interesting. See, plants are pretty cool. We can learn a lot from them. Anyway, we'll stop there because that's the flower. And that's basically how it works. It is an organ, another example of a plant organ. In our next session, we're going to get into some deeper study of plant tissues, plant cells, and some of the more grade 11 topics. So far, we've just been reviewing what we learned in grade 9 and 10. And we'll stop there.